What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Thank you for joining me. I'm Ryan Thomas, bringing you another edition of the Thomas Take. Today is March 20th, 2017, and I love doing segments on my show, as I have done in months past with the NFL Draft, 32 picks. But for all the MMA fans out there, for all the people that have really enjoyed my mixed martial arts perspective, whether it be within the UFC or the Bellator MMA organization, they had big news today as they announced that they will be headlining a pay-per-view card. Chael Sonnen will be headlining that card versus Wanderlei Silva on the grandest stage of them all in Madison Square Garden, June 24th. Great news for the sport. I've always had the opinion that when both the UFC and Bellator are successful, that is great for the sport of mixed martial arts. I want to see it to continue. I want to watch it continue growing, and Bellator is helping the sport grow along with the UFC, of course. So that being said, I wanted to talk about the history of the sport, as I often do, and I wanted to give you guys my 10 greatest fights of all time in the UFC. Bellator is a new organization, maybe relatively 8 years old, 9 years old, and the UFC has been around for quite some time, over 25 years to be exact. So there's been a lot of great fights over the course of my fanhood. It started when I was a little lad, watching the great, pioneers of the sport blossom into the revered legends that they are today. And when I came up with this list, it was so hard to put together 10 fights that are the greatest fights of all time, that I consider to be the greatest fights of all time. Most of these fights, actually all of these fights, were main events, I'm pretty sure. Actually, this one tonight was not a main event. This fight, my 10th ranked fight in terms of the greatest 10 UFC fights of all time. This fight took place at UFC 79 as the co-main event for UFC 79. The main event of that card was George St. Pierre putting his UFC welterweight belt on the line versus Matt Hughes. And the co-main event featured Chuck the Iceman Liddell taking on Wanderlei the Axe Murderer Silva. Now this fight was years in the making, as Wanderlei was the pride of pride and Chuck Liddell was the pride of the UFC. The two biggest names in MMA history at that point for the UFC light heavyweight division, definitely two of the biggest names in the sports history, finally went head-to-head at UFC 79. And it was a back-and-forth fight. As expected, it was advertised as a fight in which Wanderlei Silva and Chuck Liddell were both coming off 2 consecutive losses at the time. Chuck Liddell coming off a loss to Quentin Jackson and Keith Jardine, and Wanderlei Silva, this was his first fight in the UFC since the Pride merger. His last 2 losses were in Pride. So if Wanderlei Silva got off to a loss via knockout in the UFC, that would reset his career. If Chuck Liddell was on a 3-fight losing streak in the UFC, that would also be a dawn of a new day in his career, uncharted territory for both guys, and for both Silva and Chuck Liddell. So very interesting to see, what was going to happen in this fight. This was a light heavyweight fight, of course. And Chuck Liddell needed to get back on track. Wanderlei Silva needed to get back on track. And it was a fight that went back and forth. And in terms of the historical perspective that this fight had, this put the hardcore MMA fan base together as one. Whether you were a pro-Pride, anti-UFC guy, or whether you were a pro-UFC, anti-Pride guy, nobody really cared who was fans of which organization. You just wanted to see these two guys fight. And it was billed the built for a long time, 4 or 5 years in the making. Chuck Liddell even had a short stint in Pride, tournament style, in which him and Wanderlei Silva just never crossed paths. And it finally happened on that grand stage at UFC 79. A fight in which Liddell was dropped, Wanderlei was dropped. Wanderlei was at one point ducking Chuck's punches completely, just going underneath, in and out, shoulder rolling Chuck Liddell. And Wanderlei is not the fastest guy on earth, but Chuck Liddell was putting everything he had on his punches, so much so the fact that he threw his patented overhand right and dropped down to his knees over the course of that fight. He threw the overhand right so hard he literally fell to the ground. So these guys were going for broke. This fight was billed as a fight that would dictate the pace of their careers. It would send one guy in the top five into the top five, leave him in the top five, or it could be the end of the career for another fighter. And the aftermath of this fight was the fact that Chuck Liddell got the victory. He won the fight. Wanderlei Silva stayed at the UFC's light heavyweight division for a little while and moved down to the middleweight division. So this was a fight in which it was billed as a fight that would change the trajectory of both fighters' careers, and it did just that. Now, Wanderlei is still fighting. He's set to fight against Chael Sonnen in June. Chuck Liddell had a trajectory of, although he beat Wanderlei Silva in that fight, he really did not blossom from there. Wanderlei, as I said, was coming off 2 consecutive losses, one of which was to Mirko Krokop, one of which was to Dan Henderson in Pride, both knockout losses. So the writing was on the wall possibly for Chuck Liddell to knock him out again. That was what was favored to have happened going into that fight, but it went to a hard-fought, gritty decision in which Liddell won via unanimous decision, but Wanderlei gave Chuck a show. That is an understatement. Wanderlei took some of Chuck's best punches, and Chuck took some of Wanderlei's best punches. A great fight. In terms of the historical perspective, this fight ranks in the top 10, and I know that there's going to be a lot of guys saying, how do you have this fight 10th in terms of the top 10 greatest fights, in a fight that featured 2 of the greatest UFC light heavyweights, a weight class in which the UFC was very prominent in that weight class from the get-go. That was the weight class that really made the UFC popular in the Zuffa era, with guys like Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, and in the pre-Pride merger. Wanderlei Silva post-Pride merger was one of those guys as well, along with Quentin Jackson, that made that weight class even more, it allowed them to gain even more notoriety. So this fight was, as expected, a fight that delivered. Wanderlei fought Keith Jardine afterwards, KO'd him in the first round, lost to Quentin Jackson, lost to Rich Franklin, beat Michael Bisping, lost to Chris Lieben, beat Kung Lee, lost to Rich Franklin again, and then his last fight was all the way back in 2013, which was a KO victory over Brian Stan, who is now one of the main UFC commentators. So that was 4 years ago. Chuck Liddell, on the other hand, hasn't fought in quite some time, and I don't expect him to fight ever again. Chuck Liddell is a guy that his last signature win, the last win of his career, although it was a win that was expected to put him in a new trajectory of his career, that fight was the last win of Chuck Liddell's career. His 21st victory out of the 26 fights that he had fought at the time. A unanimous decision. Chuck went on to become a knockout victim to Rashad Evans, a knockout victim to Shogun Hua, and a knockout victim, last but not least, to Rich Franklin back in June of 2010. So Wanderlei is still, quote-unquote, active, even though he hasn't fought in 4 years. Chuck Liddell, on the other hand, hasn't fought in 7 years, and I don't expect him to. Both guys will be remembered forever as two fighters that brought the UFC, brought the sport of mixed martial arts to the masses internationally. Chuck Liddell, one of the main U.S. stars around the world that transcended mixed martial arts around the world. One of the first United States stars that really transcended around the globe. Wanderlei Silva, a Pride champion, a two-weight class Pride champion, a guy that transcended the sport in Japan, a guy that took on all comers, a guy that is still taking on all comers as he's expected to fight Chael Sonnen June 24th in Bellator. In terms of Chuck Liddell as well, one thing that gets lost on a lot of people, yes, he did lose his last three fights via KO. He did lose his last three fights to Rashad Evans, to Shogun, and to Rich Franklin. You know, Rich Franklin in their primes, Rashad Evans in their primes even. Chuck Liddell in his prime could easily have knocked out all three of those guys. But the sprawl and brawl type style in which Chuck Liddell exhibited throughout his entire career finally had caught up to him at that point. Really, the Quentin Rampage Jackson loss was a loss that Chuck did just not. He was not able to recover from that loss. Although he had the victory over Wanderlei, that was really it. After that Rampage loss, he just was not the same. That Rampage knockout, it kind of exposed Chuck. If you make Chuck come at you, and if even Chuck lands a hard shot, Chuck would often get excited and try to go for the kill, and that is when he would get caught. He would leave himself wide open for a punch or a kick, and that would be that. And that happened in virtually every case. If you go back and watch the Shogun fight, if you go back and watch the Rashad fight, if you go back and watch the Rich Franklin fight especially, he had Rich Franklin hurt. He kicked Rich Franklin right in the arm, broke Rich Franklin's arm, and Rich Franklin knocked Chuck out with the other arm. So it was from very close proximity against the cage, and it folded Chuck Liddell. I still think Chuck Liddell is one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time for the reasons that I've just stated, that he really brought the UFC to the masses. Wanderlei Silva is a guy that brought the sport of mixed martial arts to the masses as well. That's why this fight was so intriguing when it was built. You know, when the buildup was brewing of Chuck fighting Wanderlei in Pride, and then Pride folded, and it allowed Wanderlei to come over to the UFC, and this fight was finally able to happen. Dana White billed it again as a fight that would end one man's career and start a new beginning for another. And oddly enough, it didn't really do either. Chuck Liddell got that win versus Wanderlei, but that was his last career victory. So Wanderlei has bounced between each weight class, middleweight, light heavyweight, and obviously I'm assuming he'll be fighting at light heavyweight versus Chael Sonnen, Bellator 180 at Madison Square Garden Arena. That'll be a huge card, and Bellator is putting it on, and Wanderlei is going to be reaping the benefits from that pay-per-view, as will Chael. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes of that fight. I'll definitely have you guys tuned into that. Chuck Liddell, obviously a UFC pioneer, a UFC Hall of Famer, one of the greatest strikers in mixed martial arts history, as was Wanderlei Silva. That is the 10th ranked fight in my top 10 greatest UFC fights of all time, dated back UFC 79, the co-main event. I have this fight 10th because this fight was not a main event. I would have loved to have seen this fight in a 5-round main event, but it was not. It was a co-main event. It was only 3 rounds, in which Chuck Liddell, deservedly so, won by unanimous decision. There you have it, guys. That is my 10th ranked fight in my top 10 UFC greatest fights of all time.